For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was the king of late night. With his sharp wit, that famous eyebrow raise, and the kind of charm that could disarm anyone, he made hosting The Tonight Show look effortless. More than 4,500 episodes, countless stars, and a reputation as the unshakable master of late-night conversation. But behind that perfect smile, there were nights when Johnny Carson absolutely hated his job, not because of the pressure, not because of the grind, but because of certain guests who turned his stage into a nightmare. They ignored the rules, pushed too far, or drained the life out of the show. And for Carson, a man who lived for genuine laughs and authentic moments, those guests made him dread the walk to his desk. The truth is, these encounters didn't just test Carson's patience. They exposed his insecurities, his perfectionism, and just how much he valued the art of conversation. And it all started with one of the biggest names in comedy history, Bob Hope. To the public, he was an American treasure, the king of USO tours, a Christmas tradition, a comedy giant from the golden age of radio and film. But to Carson, by the 1980s, Hope had become the guest from hell. He treated The Tonight Show like a billboard, rolling in to push his specials and golf tournaments, armed with stacks of cue cards and pre-written punchlines. There was no conversation, no spark, just mechanical jokes read word for word, no matter what Johnny actually asked. Carson hated it. For a host who thrived on spontaneity, Hope's scripted appearances felt like an insult. The frustration grew so deep that, quietly, without fanfare, Carson banned Bob Hope from the show altogether. No announcements, no drama, just a silent exile that turned into one of television's biggest behind-the-scenes secrets. And when Carson retired in 1992, Hope's absence from the farewell shows said it all. But if Bob Hope was too controlled, the next guest was the exact opposite. Don Rickles, the man they called Mr. Warmth, though everyone knew it was ironic. Rickles was a whirlwind of chaos. Loud, unpredictable, and relentless. He didn't just sit for an interview, he hijacked the show. He'd snatch Carson's tie, steal his cigarette, or even shove Johnny out of his own desk. Carson would plaster on that famous smile, but inside, he hated losing control. Rickles wasn't just a guest. He was a storm, and every appearance left Johnny wondering if his own show was slipping right through his fingers. If you look closely, you could see it. A flicker in Johnny's jaw, the kind of tension that betrayed what the smile tried to hide. He respected Don Rickles. He admired his talent, but he hated losing control of his own show. Trust me, unlike Bob Hope's lifeless promotions, Rickles was funny, brilliantly funny. The problem was that Rickles didn't just join an interview. He steamrolled it. Carson, who thrived on balance and precision, found himself forced into the rare role of sidekick on his own stage, and that was something he couldn't stand. But Johnny was strategic. Instead of banning Rickles outright, he found a clever solution. He'd insist Rickles only appear on nights with other guests. That way, Rickles had more than one target, spreading the chaos around instead of burying Johnny beneath it. "If Don's coming on, make sure we've got at least 2 other people booked," a staffer remembered him saying. It worked, most of the time. Their push and pull gave the show some of its most legendary moments, like the night Rickles broke Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting, only for Carson to track him down at a restaurant in front of rolling cameras. It was mayhem, but it was magic. The difference was, beneath all the chaos, there was real affection. Carson knew Rickles was a genius. Rickles knew not to push Johnny too far. It was a dangerous dance, but one that kept audiences glued to the screen. But the same couldn't be said about the next guest, because where Rickles thrived on chaos, Madonna came armed with something even more dangerous: control. It was 1987, and Madonna wasn't just a pop star anymore. She was a global phenomenon. Bold, controversial, and utterly unafraid of making people squirm. The night she walked onto Carson's stage, the dynamic flipped instantly. She wasn't there to be interviewed. She was there to take over. From the first question, Madonna twisted the format. Instead of answers, she fired back with innuendos, flirtations, and provocations. Carson leaned back, literally trying to create space between them. His smile stayed, but his eyes gave him away. He wasn't in charge anymore. For decades, Carson had been the one making the playful jokes, turning the flirtation into comedy gold. But with Madonna, the roles reversed. She turned the charm back on him, leaving Johnny rattled and the audience buzzing. It was like watching the dance floor switch leaders in real time, and Carson did not like it. When the cameras stopped, he told his producer flatly, "Let's not do that again." Future invitations never came. Madonna had succeeded in creating a headline moment, but she left behind one of the few Tonight Show interviews that Johnny truly regretted. And yet, as uncomfortable as Madonna made him, nothing compared to the disaster that unfolded when Truman Capote walked through the curtain. By then, Capote was already slipping. Once celebrated as one of America's greatest writers, he had become infamous for his drinking, his bitterness, and his unraveling public appearances. On The Tonight Show, it all came to a head. From the moment he sat down, the trouble was obvious. Slurred words, rambling tangents, inappropriate laughter that hung heavy in the air. Carson tried everything, shorter questions, gentler topics, steering the ship any way he could, but there was no saving it. Truman was too far gone. And then it got worse. Capote turned hostile, mocking other writers, taking cheap shots at celebrities, and finally aiming a barb directly at Johnny himself, suggesting that the host wasn't smart enough to discuss serious literature. Carson didn't snap. He didn't lash out. Instead, he gave a tight smile and flicked his eyes toward Ed McMahon. It was a silent signal. This is bad. The audience wasn't sure what to do. At first, they laughed nervously, thinking maybe Capote was doing a bit. But as the minutes dragged on, it became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't an act. It was a train wreck, a genius unraveling live on stage, and Johnny Carson stuck in the middle of it. As the minutes dragged on, the room shifted. Nervous laughter gave way to silence, broken only by the occasional awkward chuckle. The truth was undeniable. Truman Capote was in no shape to be on live television. Carson never talked publicly about the interview, but he didn't have to. Capote was never invited back. Whenever his name came up in production meetings, Johnny would simply shake his head and say, "I think we've had quite enough of Mr. Petey's said." Capote, that night, haunted Carson. He'd always had sympathy for performers battling personal demons. He enjoyed his own drinks, after all. But this was different. Capote wasn't just tipsy. He was incoherent, hostile, and unraveling in front of millions. To Johnny, that crossed a line. Viewers tuned in for entertainment, not to watch a public meltdown. The segment didn't just feel awkward. It felt exploitative, and Carson refused to ever let that happen again. Yet while Capote represented the tragedy of genius lost to addiction, the next guest represented something far less tragic but nearly as maddening: endless, unstoppable chatter. Shelley Winters was a Hollywood powerhouse. A two-time Oscar winner, a respected actress, and an undeniable star. But on The Tonight Show, she was a nightmare. Every appearance was the same. Johnny would ask a simple question, and Shelley would launch into a story. Then another, tangents about her ex-husbands, her lovers, her past films. By the time Carson tried to redirect, she was already 3 stories deep. A cameraman noticed Johnny's subtle tell during her visits, a faint drumming of his fingers on the desk. With most guests, you'd see it once or twice. With Winters, it was non-stop. She didn't read cues either. If Carson leaned in to wrap things up, she plowed right over him. If he tried to interject, she talked louder. To the audience, it was chaos. To Carson, it was torture. Behind the scenes, Johnny would ask, "Why do we keep booking her?" The answer was simple. She was too important to ban. So the staff invented what they called the Shelley Protocol. Shorter segments, more aggressive interruptions. Pairing her with other guests so she couldn't dominate the stage. It never solved the problem, but it contained it. And yet, even through his private frustration, Carson kept it professional. He respected her talent, even as her appearances drained him. That balance, honoring the guest while silently suffering, defined Johnny at his core. But sometimes even he couldn't hide the suffering. Which brings us to Dick Shawn, the comic who was so strange, so absurd, that even Johnny Carson himself couldn't fake a smile. Shawn wasn't like the others. He wasn't drunk, hostile, or domineering. He was just bizarre. Known for surreal comedy and avant-garde routines, he treated the Tonight Show stage like his own experimental playground. Instead of witty banter, Johnny would get nonsensical monologues, long pauses, and sudden shifts into wild characters. Sometimes Shawn would leap into the audience or perform physical stunts with no explanation. Carson loved wit. He appreciated irony. But what he couldn't stand was comedy that seemed designed to confuse instead of entertain. And that's exactly what Dick Shawn brought to his stage. For Johnny, it wasn't just odd. It was a violation of everything he believed television should be. Carson's discomfort with Dick Shawn was written all over his face. The tight smile, the restless fingers, the subtle sigh of relief when the segment ended. Viewers who knew Johnny's usual rhythm could see it. And when things got especially abstract, Carson would toss a quick aside to Ed McMahon, a sly line like, "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it, Dick," or, "I think I need to lie down after that one." It was his way of letting the audience know they weren't crazy. Yes, what they had just seen was as strange as it felt. Behind the curtain, Carson was less diplomatic. To his producers, he complained that Shawn treated The Tonight Show like a personal experiment instead of respecting the audience. He admitted the man was talented, but this wasn't a theater for experimental comedy. It was mainstream TV, watched by millions. Still, Shawn kept coming back. Out of respect for his reputation, Carson allowed it. But his team carefully managed the damage. Shorter slots, late-night scheduling, and always following him with safer, conventional guests to reset the tone. What made Shawn unique was that Carson respected the intellect behind the madness. He himself dabbled in absurdity with sketches like Karnak the Magnificent. But the difference was simple. Carson believed comedy had to connect with the viewer, not alienate them. Shawn, in Johnny's eyes, cared more about challenging the audience than entertaining them. That tension defined their uneasy relationship. But if Dick Shawn was frustrating, the next guest went beyond frustration. He nearly sparked a fight. On July 28, 1987, viewers witnessed one of the strangest interviews in Tonight Show history. Crispin Glover, fresh off Back to the Future, walked on stage in platform shoes, a wig, and bizarre clothes, acting like a character no one understood. What followed was 6 minutes of escalating tension that ended with Johnny Carson looking genuinely furious. From the start, Glover fidgeted, mumbled nonsense, and dodged every question. When Carson tried to redirect toward his film projects, Glover pulled out old magazine clippings and began reading them aloud. The studio grew restless, the audience shifted nervously, and Ed McMahon, usually quick with a laugh, stayed silent, clearly uneasy. Then came the breaking point. Out of nowhere, Glover stood and declared, "I can kick." He swung his leg high, so close to Carson's head that the host recoiled in shock. The mask slipped. Carson wasn't smiling anymore. He snapped, "I think I have to go check on the chicken backstage," and half rose from his seat, clearly seconds away from walking off. He didn't, but the fury in his face was unmistakable. As the segment ended, Carson all but shoved the show back to normal, telling viewers they'd return to our regularly scheduled program. During the break, he erupted at his staff, demanding to know how the booking had happened, and making one thing clear: Crispin Glover would never set foot on his stage again. Years later, people would learn that Glover had been in character for his little-known film, Reuben and Ed. But in 1987, no one knew that to Carson. It wasn't performance art. It was a dangerous, disrespectful stunt that crossed a line from bizarre to threatening. Unlike most awkward moments, this one showed something rare in Johnny: real anger. And just when it seemed like nothing could top the chaos of Glover, another guest arrived who managed to push Carson to an even more unprecedented decision: to erase an interview from existence altogether. That man was Oliver Reed. Reed was a British actor famous for his intensity on screen and his heavy drinking off it. But when he sat across from Carson in the early 1970s, he was so intoxicated, so belligerent, that the segment was pulled from rebroadcast. From the moment he walked on, Reed was combative, slurring, staggering, and spoiling for a fight. Carson tried everything, speeding up questions, steering toward his films, even leaning on humor. But Reed wasn't just drunk. He was hostile. The audience fell silent, sensing the danger in the air. Carson finished the segment, but afterward he made a rare call. The footage would never air again. No reruns. No clip shows. It was erased from Tonight Show history. "That one doesn't get a clip reel," he told his staff. For Johnny, it wasn't just an awkward interview. It was a violation of what he believed television should be. Unlike some talk show hosts who thrived on chaos, Carson didn't see value in humiliating guests or showcasing hostility for shock value. He wanted people entertained, not disturbed. Reed crossed that line and Johnny blacklisted him for good. If his name came up later, Carson would shake his head. "We've seen quite enough of Mr. Reed." In a career spanning thousands of interviews, that decision stood out. Carson had faced drunks, eccentrics, even aggressive comedians. But Oliver Reed created something he couldn't accept: television that was ugly, hostile, and devoid of joy. For Johnny Carson, that wasn't entertainment, that was failure.